About a year ago, Russia began an invasion of Ukraine that sent shockwaves throughout Europe and beyond. This event had far-reaching consequences, especially for the global economy, as energy and food markets were severely impacted, causing prices to skyrocket to unprecedented levels. However, not much has been said about the impact of this war on Ukraine's economy. In this video, we will take a closer look at Ukraine's economy before and after the invasion. We'll explore how the country was doing economically and how the war affected key sectors, such as agriculture, industry, and exports. What was the economy of Ukraine like before Crimea's annexation by Russia? Well, before the whole Crimea debacle, Ukraine's economy was a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, they had some promising sectors like agriculture and IT that were seeing growth and attracting foreign investment. But on the other hand, they were dealing with a lot of economic challenges, including corruption, a large debt burden, and a struggling industrial sector. One thing that really hurt Ukraine's economy was the political instability that had been going on for years. They had a bunch of different leaders come and go, and there was a lot of infighting and protests that made it hard to get anything done. This led to a lack of investment and a general sense of uncertainty among businesses and consumers. Despite all of these challenges, though, Ukraine was still making progress in some areas. They had signed a trade agreement with the European Union in 2014, which was seen as a positive step towards modernizing their economy and increasing their ties with the West. And as I mentioned earlier, the IT sector in particular was really starting to take off, with lots of young Ukrainians getting involved in startups and entrepreneurship. Of course, all of that progress was derailed when Russia annexed Crimea and started fanning the flames of conflict in eastern Ukraine. The resulting war and instability have taken a huge toll on the country, both in terms of human lives and economic damage. But before all that, there was at least some hope for Ukraine's economic future. How did Ukraine develop its economy after Crimea's annexation by Russia? After the annexation, Ukraine made some efforts to develop its economy in the aftermath of Crimea's annexation. One of the key steps has been a push towards greater economic integration with the European Union. In 2016, Ukraine signed a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, which has helped to boost trade between the two entities. The country has also implemented a number of economic reforms aimed at improving its business climate, including measures to reduce corruption and improve the efficiency of state-owned enterprises. Another important area of focus was the development of Ukraine's IT sector. This industry saw significant growth in recent years, with many young Ukrainians getting involved in startups and entrepreneurship. The government supported this trend by launching initiatives to provide training and support for entrepreneurs, as well as investing in IT infrastructure and creating tax incentives for IT companies. Until Russia decided it was time to end Ukraine's economic progress. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So you know how everyone thought Ukraine was going to fall to Russia really quickly? Turns out that didn't happen. Ukraine was able to push back the Russian forces trying to take over Kyiv, and they even took back some of the territories that Russia had captured. So Ukraine's military is doing pretty well right now, but it hasn't been easy. A lot of people have died, tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The UN even said that 6,595 civilians have died so far, and they think there will be more. On top of that, over a third of Ukraine's population has had to leave their homes. 6.5 million people are displaced within Ukraine, and almost 8 million have had to flee to other European countries. Since the Russian forces weren't able to win on the battlefield, they started attacking civilians with missiles and drones. It's been really bad, and lots of people have been hurt. Plus, the Russian blockade of Black Sea ports is making it hard for Ukraine to export things and bring in the money they need to buy important stuff. And to make things worse, the government has had to spend a lot of money on the military, which is putting a lot of pressure on the economy. The economic impact of the war on Ukraine. The pandemic took a small toll on Ukraine's economy, but they managed to grow by 3.2% in 2021, and were on track to do the same in 2022. But then, bam! The invasion messed everything up. The initial attack hit the capital, Kyiv, and some other regions that make up more than half of Ukraine's GDP. As a result, Their economy shrank by a whopping 15.1% in the first quarter of 2022, and it got even worse in the second quarter with a 37.2% drop. Even though the fighting is mostly happening in regions that contribute less to their GDP, the World Bank predicts that Ukraine's economy will shrink by a third this year. That's a massive hit, way worse than the usual 15% threshold that economists consider a severe economic disaster. But what's really sad is how unevenly this is affecting people. Before the war, only a small 2.5% of Ukrainians lived in extreme poverty, which is pretty similar to Italy and Spain. But now it's estimated that this number will increase tenfold in 2022 and keep rising in 2023. And the closer people are to the front line, the worse it gets because of shortages. All this will cause prices to go up, making it even harder for people to buy what they need. That's why it's super important for the government to help out low and middle income folks right now. How has Ukraine been conducting business since the war? Despite the constant danger of shelling, destruction of buildings and equipment, and workers having to relocate, most businesses in Ukraine have managed to keep their operations going. How do they do it? Well, some companies have moved to safer areas of the country, leading to growth in those regions. For example, in March 2022, 3 regions in central and western Ukraine that haven't been affected by the war grew by more than 8% compared to the previous year. The IT sector has been lucky, as it requires minimal capital input and has been able to keep operating despite the war. Sectors like retail that are far away from the fighting have almost returned to their pre-war levels of activity by September. However, sectors that are heavily represented in the fighting regions or require a lot of capital, like metal production, have had to scale down a lot. Even the biggest steel producer in Ukraine, Metinvest, had to reduce its overall output by 50-70% after losing 2 plants in Mariupol. But there's been some good news, too. In July, the UN helped negotiate a grain deal that allowed for partial grain exports, which has been great for the agricultural economy. The export revenues might even be enough to plant for the next season. All of these adjustments have helped stabilize the economy in the early autumn. But things have taken a turn for the worse since October. Russia has been attacking critical infrastructure and has destroyed about 40% of the Ukrainian power grid. As I'm writing this, there's been news of another Russian attack. The mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, has reported that 80% of the capital has no electricity or water supply. In response, the government has rationed electricity and is prioritizing key sectors like healthcare and public transportation to receive at least some power. Some businesses have found ways to adjust to temporary power outages. Dentists, for example, can schedule their visits according to the electricity rationing schedule. Some producers, like the KMZ factory in Poltava, which makes grain handling equipment, are running their production at night. Coffee shops have switched to selling simpler filter coffee instead of energy-intensive espresso. Those who can afford it are buying electric generators. The government has also prepared thousands of shelters, called Points of Invincibility, where Ukrainians can receive essential services for free 24/7 in anticipation of disruptions to electricity, water, and heating supply. How can the world help Ukraine during these tough times? Ukrainians and businesses there are always changing and trying to adapt to their situation. But right now, the country needs to focus on fixing up the civilian infrastructure so that people can have jobs, and the most vulnerable folks don't end up in extreme poverty. At the same time, they also need to make sure their military is supplied so they can keep fighting. The President, Volodymyr Zelensky, recently spoke at meetings with the World Bank and IMF and said that Ukraine needs a whole lot of money, like $38 billion, to cover their budget deficit in 2023. And on top of that, they need another $17 billion to start fixing all the infrastructure that's been messed up. If they can get all this support, it'll be a big help in keeping their economy from totally falling apart and making sure they can keep fighting for their country.